Stormy. Many of you already know Stormy. She is the director of the Open Source Program Office at Microsoft. And there she works with people and teams across Microsoft to help make sure the company uses and contributes to open source software in a way that makes it possible for the world to achieve more through open source. Before joining Microsoft, she held leadership positions at in Red Hat, in open source and in developer roles at Red Hat, where she was the head of community leads. The Cloud Foundry Foundation, where she was the VP of Developer Relations, and then at Mozilla, where she led developer relations. And previously, she also served as the executive director of the GNOME Foundation and at OpenLogic, where she set up their OpenLogic expert community. I think anybody who knows Stormy or heard her talk knows that she's very passionate about open source software and likes to educate companies and communities on how open source software is changing the software industry. And with no further ado, I will throw it over to Stormy.
Thanks.
And thank you again.
So I'm just going to share slides here. So thanks for having me here today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm going to talk to you about lessons that Microsoft has learned working with open source, but as someone who runs an open source programs office, all of us that do that love open source, and so we very much like to work in a collaborative fashion. So I actually see a couple of my colleagues in the industry in the audience. It's all about working together. So these are not lessons that are unique to Microsoft. These are not lessons that Microsoft learned first, although some of them we may have learned the hard way, and some of them we got lucky because they fit our culture. So I would love to have a conversation about it. So feel free to drop questions in the Q&A. And if we have time at the end, we can open up the mic and let people share findings as well. But this whole industry of working with open source is about collaborating to get to a better way of working with open source. So what I was going to do is share what open source at Microsoft looks like, and then some of the ways that we've handled it to share some of the lessons that we learned. So hopefully others can learn from that, and others can teach us things that we haven't learned yet. So I think a lot of us, when we think about open source software, we think about the tools that you use. We think about code and documentation and making pull requests. But when it comes to putting open source in a very large organization, and probably even in a small organization, it's actually a lot about culture too. It's about learning how to work together and learning about different ways of working. I like to say, so at Microsoft, like one of the things that we had is a really strong culture of ownership of code. We're a software company at heart, and people took pride in their software. And obviously, if you started using my software, I would support it for you. And obviously, if you started using my software and you found something wrong with it, you would just tell me and I would fix it. You wouldn't touch my code. And so that was very opposite from open source software. So we had a journey, and we still have a journey to get to a different way of working. We've been on this journey for a long time, probably about 20 years. I would say like Microsoft's first contribution to open source software was being the common enemy. When I was the executive director at the GNOME Foundation, it brought GNOME and KDE and a whole bunch of people together because we were going to beat Windows. Since then, Microsoft has also gotten into the open source collaboration. And I think and they've been doing it, but I think one of the key accelerators was when Satya Nadella became CEO about 6 years ago, and he really brings this culture of helping others achieve their goals to the entire organization, which has helped us really drive open source software into the way that our employees work and the way that they're measured in their jobs. So I just wanted to, I'm sure you all know, but I like to throw the slide up to show like the scale of this. So take a look at number 8, the bottom number there. 80 to 90% of the code in new applications is open source. So 80 to 90% of it is code that already exists out there that you're pulling from. Then you're part of that community, whether you choose to contribute back or not, whether you ever do anything about that. I think that indicates the scale of what we're talking about, how much open source software has changed the way we develop software. I think it's really outstanding. This slide is out of order. I skipped one. I'm sorry, my slides seem to be going forward and not backwards. So I'm giving you the. I'm just going to go here. And so we've also found that open source software, not only is all the software being built on open source software, but organizations are recognizing this, and their developers are recognizing this. So organizations that are using more open source software are more innovative. This was from a McKinsey study from last year, April, right after COVID started. And they're also seeing like much higher satisfaction rates. So people that get to use open source software and develop in it are much more likely to stay with the company and to be happy in their job. We actually find when we recruit for interns, this is a really key factor, that they want to be working on open source software too. And it's not just us, it's like tons of our customers. I've actually talked to many of our customers about creating open source programs offices in particular. And we've just seen a trend. The To-Do Group came out with a study just recently about what the world of OSPOs looks like in the industry. And what we saw was a huge increase in the number of OSPOs in governments and education, as well as other fields. So I have been talking to companies that are like, banks in South America, large retail companies in the US, automotive companies in Europe, and all of these organizations are realizing that they're consuming, using, and contributing enough open source software that they would like to put processes in place and OSPO in place. So I want to talk about how we handle the way we use open source and what we learned along the way. And like I said, I would love to hear from you what you've learned and, where we want to go from here. There are tons of places to have conversations around open source programs offices. The To-Do Group is one that I participate in a lot. There's also OSPO++, which had some great conversations around educational organizations. So lots of places to have these conversations. First, I'm going to give you the scale. At Microsoft, we have, this is an old number because these are public slides. I can just tell you the new internal numbers are over 80,000 unique open source software components that we are tracking, that somebody at Microsoft, a developer, has downloaded and is using or is shipping in part of a product. And the bottom number should be 11 million now. There are 11 million instances of those usages. So we are tracking that in a database. We're tracking that there are 11 million instances of an open source software component being used in some piece of software or environment at Microsoft. And we do that so in case there's ever like a security vulnerability or an issue, we can immediately reach out to the people that are using that software and say, hey, there's a problem. Here's what we recommend you do. And I don't know what the new number is. I know it's bigger than 30,000, but there's 30,000 Microsoft employees who have associated their GitHub account with their Microsoft identity. At Microsoft, we made the choice that this is a voluntary association. So you can, a lot of our employees have GitHub accounts, and if they want to associate it with their Microsoft identity, they can do so. And then we can help with a number of things. I'm not going to walk you through this whole slide. I just wanted to point out that Microsoft has been doing open source software for a long time. One of the facts that always stands out to me, because it was a surprise when I realized it, is in 2009, Microsoft was actually the largest contributor to the Linux kernel. We gave 20,000 lines of code to the Linux kernel at that time. We're still a huge user and provider of Linux, especially in the Azure platform. We have a lot of Linux containers that customers use. A couple of other things that have happened along the way is we've open sourced a lot of really awesome developer tools. So TypeScript, .NET, VS Code. As a software company, creating these software development tools has become a strength of ours, and we're sharing them in open source with the community because we found that that's the best way to work with developers. And we acquired GitHub, which is very much along that vein of helping developers. One of the lessons that we learned here was that our developers that are working on these projects, that are working on like VS Code or TypeScript, suddenly their users have complete access to them. So they're working on the source, they're in the issues, they're on GitHub, and a user can directly ask them a question. And that's really powerful and really awesome, because before that, all of the questions and and all of the product feature requests and all of the issues that somebody found would have either been channeled through our support organization or through our PMs, the product managers, we call them program managers at Microsoft. They would have been the ones that actually talked to those customers and brought those requests and issues in. And now there's actually a direct channel between the developer and that user. It's not where we want users to go to for support. And we actually had a whole issue and lessons learned on that. But it does mean that the developer gets a lot more exposure to actual frontline usage. So we're contributing in a number of areas, like I said, Linux, especially Linux on Azure, a lot of developer tools and languages. There's a lot of really fun stuff coming out in the data and AI space. I won't go into details on any of these, but if you're ever interested, these communities are all open source and open to everybody to contribute to. These aren't our communities, these are ones that we work on. So I run the open source programs office, and I wanted to talk about it a little bit because it is how we do our compliance work at Microsoft and how we interact with open source. So Microsoft's mission is to enable individuals and organizations to achieve more. That's our goal. And in the open source programs office, we discussed it and we thought that was an awesome mission, and we would just put the words "through open source" at the end of it and adopt that mission as our own. So our goal is to help individuals and organizations achieve more through open source. We are a very internally focused organization. So our goal is to help Microsoft developers use open source software effectively to do their job better. We do talk to customers, we do give talks like this, but we're focused internally. And it's not just, it takes, this is a lesson learned. It takes a lot of people to do this right, and a lot of different types of roles. And it's very much about collaboration, even inside an organization the size of Microsoft. We have 50,000 developers, not counting all the other employees. So we work, we're the open source programs office, but we work very closely with an open source engineering team that does all of our tooling. We work very closely with a legal team, which was instrumental in getting Microsoft to adopt more open source software. They are our champions. We have an open source executive council, which is a lot of CVPs, vice presidents that sit across Microsoft that meet quarterly to talk about how open source is going in their organizations and to share best practices and strategy. We work with the HR team to make sure people are being measured on open source and have training that they need. And we have several teams in the security team that focus on open source. So we were a software company, Microsoft is a software company. And so we approach this very much from a software perspective. So I'm just gonna kind of briefly tell you how it works. All of this is done in tooling, like it's in the software build system. So anyone at Microsoft is welcome to download any open source software. And as soon as they inject it into the build system, we will automatically detect it, like our tooling will detect it. And the tooling will immediately use an open source tool called Clearly Defined to find the license. It'll ask them how they're using it. Are they going to ship it? Is it for internal use? What's it look like? And then it'll kick off legal and business reviews if they're needed. And it uses that developer's organizational information. So the business reviews are done by someone in their organization. We have a release checklist if they're going to be open sourcing something. We have a whole naming and governance guidance. A huge lesson learned is that picking the right name if you're going to open source something is really critical. We actually drove our escalations down from maybe a handful a year to 0 a year by putting in a naming process. And then we create notice files, we provide a place to put the source code, and that's all done in our tooling system. And so I think that's a huge lesson. The more you can automate, obviously in the beginning you don't know what all you need and you don't know what all you're using, but if you can automate it over time, I think it's very powerful. And different bits and pieces of it are open source. We've open sourced some of ours, but there's not really a solution right now that an organization could adopt from beginning to end to do all that. So we're still working on that. On the right-hand side of the slide are things that we do a little more manually, but we are actively looking to change the culture and evolve it to grow it, not to change it, but to grow it, to be more collaborative. And so we've done things like adopt the FOSS Fund, where we give $10,000 a month to an open source software project that our employees have nominated and selected. We have a whole workshop set up for open source software that you can take through the Microsoft training system. So it's like how to grow a community, how to open source something, how to enforce a code of conduct. All of those tasks that are difficult are in there. And what we found at the workshops was that people really enjoyed and appreciated the chance to get to talk to their colleagues. What they really wanted was networking. They need a little bit of knowledge, but they need a lot of confidence because there's a lot of imposter syndrome going on. I mean, people are, been working in proprietary software their entire careers, and all of a sudden they're on a project where they're expected to post code publicly, and it's a little bit intimidating. So having your peer group and other people who've done that really helps. And then we have internal open source groups. So we have meetups and mailing lists and Teams chats where you can connect with people. We've created a lot of tools, especially to help us use GitHub as an enterprise, like to help people, create a good repo from the beginning with a good standard code of conduct, with clearly stating how support should or shouldn't work for that product, so customers don't get stuck waiting for issues on the open source software project when they think they've bought like an immediate turnaround support contract. And we've written tools like tools like Clearly Defined that do all the licensing lookup through an API query. And we've been open sourcing many of these. You can find them in our GitHub repo, the Microsoft organization. But we're also continuing to work on how we can open source these in a way that's useful to other people. I mentioned Clearly Defined already. The other one that I think is really interesting is OpenChain. We had customers that wanted to make sure that what we were giving them, that the software we were giving them, if it contained open source, that we had done the right thing and that they wouldn't get in trouble for giving it to their customers or for using it. And they wanted to know is that we had all these processes in place and that we were looking at all of the licenses. So our attorneys actually worked with the Linux Foundation, and our legal group that works on open source also works on open standards. And so they were familiar with these standard ways of doing things. And so they started the OpenChain process, which basically is it is now an ISO standard for open source, where a company can say, we've done all the following steps, we are OpenChain compliant. And then your customers can know that you're OpenChain compliant and trust that the software you give them is legally accurate, like that you've not violated any licenses, that you've included the source code where you need to, that you've complied with all your open source licenses. And it includes things like having certain roles at the company, having people go through certain training. There's a number of steps in that. This is definitely a best practice. We have an open source software policy that we have documented inside of Microsoft, that we've summarized it for an external website. You can go to opensource.microsoft.com and see it. But internally, it is super extensive and detailed, and it goes from everything from using open source software to contributing to open source software to releasing it. And any question we get, we try to update our documentation. So if someone in New Zealand is working on some software and they have a question about whether or not they can use a package, they can go here anytime and a lot of us were at the Open Source Summit, and it was great to see people again. But we participate in a number of organizations, a number of foundations. While foundations aren't the only way to financially support open source software, they are a pretty critical way of both financially supporting software development, but also getting people to collaborate, giving them a clear place to go to work together, and helping to do governance for projects. They're super important in the open source ecosystem. If you are interested in open source programs offices in particular, there are also several organizations that I mentioned earlier, but like the To Do Group and OSPO++ and others that are focused on just on how to help companies use open source software. And companies, organizations, educational organizations, governments, there's a lot going on right now. I mentioned FOSS Fund before, but I wanted to call it out now. So FOSS Fund it was started by Dwayne O'Brien at Indeed, and the idea is he wanted to give back to projects that maybe he didn't know the company was even using, and he also wanted to encourage participation. So Microsoft has adopted the FOSS Fund. The way we do it is it's $10,000 once a month that we give to a project that is both nominated and then voted by our employees as someone we would like to financially recognize. And and it's either something Microsoft uses or an organization that is promoting diversity and inclusion, because we want to help grow the ecosystem in open source. And the key is that the people that vote have to have contributed to a Microsoft open source software project in the previous couple of months in order to be qualified to vote. So it's both to encourage people to participate and also to reward the projects that we found beneficial to work with. And some of the projects, you can go to our website. Some of the projects that we have that we supported are things like, home smart systems, to software, to actual software that we're using in our products. It's all across the board. We just recently, like 2 weeks ago, announced Azure credits for open source. We had been doing this on a smaller scale, but now we want to launch it as a program that people can apply for. So if there's open source software projects that need Azure credits, we now have an official place where they can go and request help and request Azure credits. The initial outpour has been, an initial set of requests has been huge. We're actually reviewing them all this afternoon. So giving that section lesson learned was giving back to open source and collaborating with others. This one is more of an internal focused rewards and motivation. We think it's really important that you reward and promote people for working in open source or working in an open source fashion or even working on inner source. So every developer at Microsoft goes through a Connect review twice a year with their manager. And in the Connect, there are three main questions, three main sections. There's actually a fourth, I would say. The fourth is like, how do you want to develop your career? But the three main ones in the main section is, what did you accomplish? So what have you done this past year? Which is great. It's usually most reviews. The second one is, how did you contribute to the success of others? And it's literally worded that way. So how did you contribute to the success of others? Which is very key to open source and very key to collaborating. And great that we can recognize that people spent some of their time helping others that might not have been directly aligned with what they accomplished. And then the third one is, how did you build on the work of others? So how did you not reinvent the wheel? And how did you actually take work that others have done and build on top of it and make even better things? Which to me is what open source is all about, is that we all build on the work of others. The seeds for me about open source were planted in my it was my operating systems class in university, and we all had to write an operating system. And I remember just sitting there and thinking, wait, each one of us in this class is going to write an operating system, and we're going to have 50 operating systems. And you've been teaching this class for how many years, and how many operating systems are out there? And I just thought that was like ridiculous. I wrote my operating system, but it was definitely the key to getting me started on the path towards open source. And then another one that I mentioned briefly earlier is training and empowerment. And I originally called this training, but like I said, I think what people that come to training want is empowerment. They want to know that this is okay, that they can, submit a pull request to this project that no one there's ever heard of them, and that they don't know the person on the other side. So we put together a series of training classes. We have one that's like, how to work on GitHub as a Microsoft employee, because probably they've worked on it in their personal life. And so is it different when you're representing Microsoft or you're in the Microsoft organization? Like, are there just a couple different technical things to know? We then have a series of workshops that go through, how to enforce a code of conduct, how to open source a project, how to create a community, how to grow a community. And we're continuously adding on to that series of workshops. We're also looking at open sourcing those. So I'm not promising anything, but we're working on it. Emma Irwin on my team is really excited about that. And then we have, we've also looked at embedding, have embedded open source training into some of our standard onboarding for developers. So now when new Azure developers come on board, they go through the Azure bootcamp like they always have. Well, it's a little different now that we're all remote, but it's like a week-long Azure bootcamp. And part of that now includes a section on open source. So it's really getting the word out to all of our developers from the start, and then providing them the tools that they need going on. We also have a monthly meetup, which is internal, where we bring in sometimes we bring in internal people who've had success with open source, sometimes we bring in external speakers, but really trying to create that community and provide meaningful content so people can continue to develop their career. One training class that was really popular is like it's a how to talk to your manager checklist is the way I think of it, or class, because people really feel like they need their manager support, and they often feel like their manager doesn't understand why contributing back to open source is important. So we created a how to talk to your manager about open source guide. I think in general, managers are a little more open than developers think. But I have heard directly from managers that are like, what am I getting out of this? Like, why would, is my person qualified to contribute to open source? And so like there is some training that also has to happen at the manager level. So that's what I prepared. I was actually hoping for this to be interactive and have some Q&A, because it's all about working together here. So I'm going to go look and see if there's questions, but if you want to unmute your mic, you're welcome to just share your experience or share your question as well. So I know there's people in the audience that have as much experience as I do with this. So if you would like to share anything, feel free to. All right, so if I still have time, I'm gonna like ask people questions. Is that cool?
I have my hand raised.
Oh, okay.
Well, this is fantastic talk. Thank you, Stormy, and really liked it. And I have a particular question about. You've promised that some of the training material will be open source, and I'm particularly interested in how to talk to my manager about open source. Because I think it's like one of the key, within a university, we still, talk to a lot of people who are a very rudimentary sense of open source, and but are in powerful positions. And I would love to have your guidance on that.
Awesome. So it's not me, but it's others at Microsoft, but I will pass on the feedback, and I think you'll hear from Emma.
Hey, you see Thomas's hand up?
Oh, thank you. Yes, thank you, Stormy, for a really interesting presentation. I work in the semiconductor field, and there's a big push from DARPA to lower the cost of silicon hardware design. I know there's some activity at UCSC in this area, but it's kind of a nascent field, and of enabling chip design with open source tools. I guess one of the challenges is, I am dependent as a practitioner in my field on commercial vendors, and I don't know how to sort of couch the open source activity without upsetting the incumbent commercial folks, or at least having the potential of that. So I mean, this is amazing to see what Microsoft is doing, and it's amazing that they've hired you. I think it's really great. I'm wondering what the lessons learned might be, because these EDA tools are very expensive, and there's a lot there, and the open source world doesn't have a hope of touching that for a long time, right? So, but people who aren't deep in it don't know, and they're worried about upsetting the incumbents. How can you manage that minefield?
So I think open source is coming to the hardware world. So our ARM is having a event. I think it's next week. We recorded the talk, so I'm not sure when it was, but I think it's next week. Where I'm on a panel talking about open source, and there's lots of efforts that they have been involved in. So I think there's already players in the hardware space and in the hardware world that are focused on open source. And I would encourage you to reach out to those and maybe start with their OSPO leads, which usually that's easy to find that person.
Well, no, I'm very familiar with the open source hardware EDA world. So my question to you is, you're at Microsoft, but you started out at Red Hat. How'd that happen? Why did Microsoft buy it? Why didn't they try to kill Red Hat?
So Microsoft's been involved in open source, not just since they hired me, but for like the last 20 years.
Well, right. Oh, that's fine. But like, I'm sorry to interrupt, and I don't mean to be rude, but I know there's time is limited. So, I mean, there are tons of engineers who are working at IBM on, proprietary Unix, Sun, proprietary Unix. Those things have been eclipsed by the disruption of open source, which is embodied by Red Hat. I mean, IBM acquired Red Hat. So, I mean, as someone who's there's a big elephant in the room. I'm not sure how to say it any other way. The fact, when I learned that Chromium was the basis for Edge, that was the day the universe changed.
So I don't think I think all good organizations grow and evolve. And so I think that's what we're seeing, is we're seeing these organizations grow and evolve and include open source software in their strategies and how they move forward. So I think what we could all do is realize that, right? They're not stuck in one spot. They're growing. The people that work there are growing. They have new people. Like, we just need to help them evolve and grow in the best way possible.
Got it. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
I had a quick question. I really like that the shout out you gave to like the To-Do group and OSPO++, which are two groups that we're members of and heavily involved in. What do you see is, what are the things you gain most, do you think, from that level, collaborating with other OSPOs and other companies? Is there something, are a couple of things that you see as the most useful aspects of being parts of those groups and collaborating across companies like that?
Yeah, three, which I'll probably forget the three before I get to all three, but three off the top of my head. One is it's just great to meet people who are thinking about the same problems that you are, that are focused on the same things. There's something about that, having a group of peers to hang out with that helps us all in our careers, right? It's like hanging out with other parents on the soccer field. Like it helps to have that community. Two, I think it helps. I don't think, sometimes I think, wow, we're not really producing enough stuff. We don't yet have a whole open source tool stack to like do this OSPO thing. But it is a place to come and say, I have this problem. How have you all solved it? And so you get immediate pointers from people who know exactly what you're facing or somewhat similar, right? And then third, in a lot of the conversations, it's also a place not just to ask for help or tools, but just to bounce ideas off, or I solve my problems best when I tell somebody about them. Just the act of articulating it makes you think about it different. And so I think it's very much a place to do that too, to say, wow, I just saw this really strange thing and it's really bugging me, and or I just had this amazing insight, or I just had this frustrating conversation with my manager, or it's a place to have that as well. So it's just, I think share best practices would be the short answer I gave people, but I think I think the networking piece is like huge.
And Jacob just actually put a question in the chat, which I'll actually probably go ahead and put into the Q&A just so we have it in the document. But it's, you list contribute to the success of others as a primary principle. What do you see as the short and long-term potential for OSPOs to help each other reach their success?
I think we should all continue meeting like we are. And I loved the group you brought together a couple of weeks ago, Jacob. I think that doing things like that is useful. And I know there's numerous groups working on software together, but I think we need to continue to do that too. continue to create software solutions for companies.
Oh, actually,
There's one in the Q&A too.
yeah, I think maybe that's where Jacob was getting this from. Sorry, I didn't realize he was.
I just put it in. Sorry,
Oh, okay.
not to confuse anyone.
Jason also had a question about what's the biggest surprise for people who are used to internal development and then go to the training. I think it's probably different at every company because every organization has a different culture to start with. For Microsoft, I think it's very much that that first anecdote that I gave, like we're a software company and I take pride in my software, and of course I will maintain it for everybody and I will fix everything for you. And of course, no one would dream of like touching my software because like it's my software. That's a really good cultural attribute at a certain point in time and a certain point in development. It doesn't work that well in open source. And I think that's the next step. I think then people tend to leap to I'm going to open source it and everyone's going to come help me out instead of, and they kind of skip the step of like, first people have to use my software before anyone's going to want to contribute to it. So developers are suddenly producing software for end users instead of just working with other developers. I don't know if that made sense, but.
Yeah, Stormy, maybe I'll follow up on that one. You know, as someone that's always worked in kind of the open community and particle physics at CERN, it seems like we have a different sort of feedback mechanism than I see in a lot of open source bulletin boards and mailing lists. And sometimes it can, at least on those mailing lists, it can get a bit, I don't know, rough, some of the communications. And I just wonder if that's different than internal development. Is that something that takes some getting used to too? And is that a lesson for the open source community to learn, if that's a little bit of a barrier?
So I think all of us that have less, I'm trying to look for the right word. All of us used to like a more cordial feedback loop inside of our organizations should encourage our employees to bring as much of that as they can to open source. Because I too have found that inside organizations, the feedback loop is usually much nicer, more pleasant, more cordial. Whereas in open source, people tend to equate often being honest with being very abrupt or very like, I think all of us could help there. Microsoft has a really strong culture of allyship, where if someone messes up in front of you, you are their ally, not to the victim, but to the person that accidentally or purposely just did the wrong thing. And the focus really is on helping them see what the impact of their actions were and to improve. And I really like that. And I've encouraged Microsoft employees to bring that to open source instead of all piling on the person who just made a mistake, seeing yourself as their ally and helping them understand what the messages typed came across very harsh or didn't have the impact that they meant, and helping them through that journey, I think is really important. So I think, Jason, we all have to help change the feedback loops that aren't so positive. All right, if there aren't any other questions.
There's one more question by Ivo Jimenez in the Q&A.
Yeah, so Ivo, do you want to say your question or you want me to read it?
So I was just wondering whether you could expand a bit on the tooling and automation. You mentioned that has helped a lot. Like what type of things, and how do you, I assume there's a lot of like that backlog of things that you can work on. How do you decide what to do, and whether you have like product managers for those tools as part of the open source engineering thing that you mentioned, and how big that team is?
Yeah, so we do have product managers. We call them program managers, but they're product managers at Microsoft. So there's currently a couple of PMs, like one focused on one of our main tools, one focused on security, and then one focused kind of more on the inner source space. And then I don't know how big the engineering team is exactly. I haven't looked, but it's around 10-ish people, I think, developing our tools. And that's just our main compliance suite of tools. We also have teams focused primarily on security or other areas. We have an organization called One Engineering System that I also don't know how big it is, but a couple hundred people that focus on build tools and compliance and security and accessibility for all of Microsoft. And so the open source engineering team is part of that group. They started out in OSPO, in the open source programs office, and I moved them over there. So I think it makes more sense to be part of the tooling that's provided to the whole company.
Awesome, thank you.
All right, with that, I'll turn it back over to Stephanie. Thanks so much for having me. If you want to reach out to me, I'm stormy.peters@microsoft.com, or you can find me on Twitter, Stormy.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Stormy. It was definitely as good as I expected, because I was really excited to have you giving this keynote. So really appreciate it. And for everyone else, first of all, everybody thank you to Stormy as well. Very great talk. Thanks for all the questions too from everyone.